to really crystallize my thoughts on the importance of the media. Some of my friends thought I was crazy. It took me that long, but the fact is it did. That it was only going there where you look at a very intense petri dish of disinformation battles and the effort by states to stay stable while these sometimes foreign, sometimes surrogate actors are pummeling them with disinformation and trying to upset their governments. It took me going to these tiny places and to realize that media is a national security asset, and maybe even more so local media, because local media is closest to the consumer. Local media is where readers and consumers of news can best tell if the reporters are doing an accurate or fair job. And I think one of the problems in this day and age is that with the death of local news outlets throughout the country, 1 in 5 have gone away since 2004, according to the great research being done at the University of North Carolina. And it seems like, and about 50% of the number of reporters that existed in 2004, only 50% are there now. So it's declined that much as, there've been consolidations, there's been buyouts, there's been, just the basic collapse of the business model. And I think that like half of those 50% that remain have all gone to Washington because actually that's how I feel. I spent most of my career in Washington and I felt like I made a marginal difference with some of the more in-depth things that I was doing. But for all the reasons that I think we're going to hear about tonight, the news cycle has just sped up so quickly, and incremental news is what seems to play minute by minute, that being in Washington now as a reporter feels somehow not as productive. Of course it's important. Of course those people are doing a heroic job, especially under this administration, which is so hard to cover. But so I find myself here in a local outlet and back to Latvia. So what the security police chief, which used to be the secret police chief under the Soviet era, but the secret police, was sort of a combination of our FBI and CIA, told me when I had an interview in his office is that the news media are a national security asset, just like oil and gas. Just like oil and gas, they keep our system going. And if they're corrupted, or if the flow of information, of good, accurate information about the rights and the wrongs that are happening is cut off, that is going to directly affect the ability of government to function, the ability of citizens to petition their government, to claim that it's doing right or claim that it's doing wrong, and to make changes. And so that's when it struck me. It took me all the way over there to figure out, yeah, we are a national security asset, because when we're gone, when we're weakened, when we're drastically weakened, all sorts of terrible things happen. And because we're in the internet age, we know that those, there are things that are happening that we could never have even imagined before. So fast forward to this election, because of the coronavirus, we are now going to have elections that are largely waged online, which gives this online ungoverned space, this cowboy, Wild West, an enormous amount of power. Luckily, a lot of American scholars, like the two I'm with today, have started figuring out how to identify and hopefully disrupt the online networks of bad actors who are really creating an environment that it's hard to, which is hard to identify when you're a consumer of news. There's no transparency either from them, and there's no transparency from the big social media networks like Facebook, who don't want you to know how their algorithms work, who don't want you to know what they know about the bad actors that may be in front of you. So local news is sort of the most authentic so far, or remaining. It's the most authentic remaining media environment, I guess. And because it's under siege itself, its business model collapsing, and then the coronavirus making revenues all that much more difficult to earn, I'm advocating that, I'm actually embedding myself in our local newspaper. I'm on the board there. I did a story recently showing how in distress they were, and really caught them at a moment where they had to let all sorts of people go and reduce their staff. Now we're down to 1.5 reporters. And it's really so difficult to do what they need to do just at the time when the local citizens need them more than ever. So I think journalism schools, to wrap up, I think journalism schools are a great place to foster a desire among younger people to start at local news. And maybe we can even, as journalism students and as the professors of journalism students, we can try to think about supplementing in a much more profound way the capacity of local news by training our reporters, by giving them internships at local news, maybe by making partnerships much more broadly than we have now, or than we have yet, with local news outlets that need our help. So I welcome your questions. Everything's on the table. And now I'll turn it over to who's next, Sarah or Naeemul? I'm not sure who's next up.
We'll turn it over to Naeemul.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending this virtual panel, and I'm honored to be here with Sarah and Dana. My research interest is in computational techniques and their use in journalism, and their use in automated fact-checking, their use in verifying online information. As we all know, that during this coronavirus pandemic, we are looking at another demic, like infodemic, or someone also says misinfodemic. So what can the newsrooms do to kind of mitigate the online misinformations that we're seeing in the social media, and also sometimes in print media and broadcast media? So we all know that mass media plays a central role in delivering risk, crisis, and healthcare information to the general public. And the US has a national objective to increase public information that follows emergency risk and healthcare communication best practices. However, previous studies have shown that there is a gap between how mass media are practicing this risk and healthcare communication and what scholars and expert practitioners advise based on supporting science-based evidence. So if there's a gap, my question is, how can we help mitigate or kind of close this gap? To give an example, in one of our previous studies, we found that on average, 4 out of 10 best practice guidelines or best practices are maintained in an average healthcare news story. So because as my background is in computer science, I am more interested in designing computation tools or automated tools. Many of my research are about how can I use technology to help the content creators, journalists, reporters to prepare better report, to write more high quality reports and news. For instance, if you consider the first thing that you look at about news is the headline, right? the headline, and in many cases we have seen that people often just read the headline and without looking at the actual content, without reading the actual content, they immediately share it in Facebook or share it in Twitter, in social media. So they build their first impression, they build their understanding just after reading the headline. So, and the good people, the good content creators, the good side of journalism, they try to create headlines so that people will get attracted and then click on the link and then know about the true information. But there are some people who are not so good and they try to give you misleading headlines and kind of promise you something in the headline that is not being delivered in the actual content. So as an example, the headline might say, smokers are safe from coronavirus. But when you go to the actual article, it says, no, it's a totally different story. So my research is about, one of my research is about how can we create attractive or effective headlines, at the same time non-misleading headlines. What properties, what characteristics, or what linguistic characteristics of a headline makes it more effective in terms of getting attention, at the same time not being clickbaity or misleading. Some of the findings are from this project are, we found if a headline has question in it, for example, what happens, or would you do this? So if it has a question mark at the end, based on our research, people not tend to engage much with it. But on the other hand, if the headline is more informative, then people tends to be engaging with the headlines. So that's one interesting aspect of it. The next part. So let's say the headline. What's the next best thing? The actual article, the first paragraph, the lead, the body. So how can we make more engaging content so that people, and more quality content so that people get the correct information, the high quality information. So as I said before, only 4 out of 10 best practices are actually there in the healthcare, in an average healthcare article. Can we develop kind of a assistive technology that can inform the content writers, hey, this is what you have written, and this follows these 5 best practice guidelines out of these 10 best practice guidelines. Do you want to change something so that it actually follows maybe 9 or 10 of all these best practice guidelines? You can imagine this is kind of an advanced version of a spell checker. So if we can have that, hopefully that can help the content writers to create high quality contents. Another part is sometimes we see that there is a claim made in the news article, but that claim doesn't have any supporting evidence in it. We always want to give attribution in the news. We always want to give the citation, the good reference, but hey, we are human. So it's possible, it's very much possible that we miss some attribution or we miss some references. So if there is one kind of helper out there or a automated tool that can inform me, hey, this is one claim that you mentioned, but the news doesn't have any supporting evidence or opposing evidence. So if you add those evidence, maybe the audience will feel better about this claim, or will know more appropriately about this claim. So, so we are developing natural language processing algorithms, where we're developing data mining techniques, argumentation mining techniques to help the content writers how they can create content that has both claims and evidence and stuff. So these are the kind of things that we are doing here at Merrill College to help the newsroom in terms of providing high quality contents. Some of the things that I haven't started, but I would like to start is how can we give more engagement options to the readers. For example, when social media wasn't here, the only way as a reader I could engage with the news is I can read it and I can go and tell my friends, hey, this is something I read from this news article and this newspaper. This is excellent. You should read it. After we have social media, we can easily share this to our friends and family. We can like on it. We can engage more. We can make comments. So my vision is, can we go beyond commenting, liking, and sharing? What is the next way we can create an engagement path between the readers and the news? So recently we have seen a huge improvement in natural language processing algorithms, in deep learning algorithms, and that is kind of breaking down a lot of barriers in automated conversation, in creating chatbots. So one of the ideas that I was thinking is, can we have a chatbot for, let's say, a news article? As a reader, if I have further questions about a claim in the news or a particular statement in the news, can I ask that question to the chatbot when I'm reading it? And hopefully the chatbot will automatically give me the answer of my question. So maybe that will be one way to create another kind of engagement between the readers and the content creators. Hopefully that will create more kind of knowledge that will be helpful for the content creators. Yeah. And the other things that we're doing here is we are working with fact checkers, for example, PolitiFact in US and BD Fact Check in my home country, Bangladesh. We are working with these fact checking organizations, and we're trying to understand what are the challenges that they face while fact checking, how technology can help them, and we're trying to understand their needs and design similar technologies. One observation from my works is social media, for example, Facebook and Twitter, they can play a huge role in limiting this misinformation by closely working with these fact checkers. I know that Facebook started an initiative and started working with these fact checkers, and they had some ups and downs, but we have to, and my request to the social media platforms is we have to kind of be more proactive, more transparent, and help these mostly volunteer-based fact checkers, so that both of these organizations, both of these entities can get help from each other, and the benefit will come to the general people. So these are the things that I'm doing at Merrill College, and if you have any question or if you have any suggestion, I'll be more than happy to take it. Thank you.
Naeemul, somebody's submitted a question. You mentioned misleading headlines. She suggests that most misleading headlines tend to be intentional. How do we prevent the bad actors from intentionally creating misleading headlines?
That's a very good question. So if I don't want to, if I intentionally want to have a misleading headline, who is going to block me? Maybe the social media platform. So if the Facebook or Twitter sees that it's a misleading headline and it's not going to do benefit to the actual user, maybe they can somehow filter it or somehow give it a low rank to help the users and kind of discourage this intentional writing of intentional misleading headlines.
Great, thank you. Why don't we move on to Sarah? Please do feel free to continue to submit questions for any of our three speakers. And once Sarah finishes, then we'll open it up to questions to all three of them.
Great, and Katie, thanks so much for organizing this event and an incredible turnout. So thanks everyone for taking the time. You can take the professor out of the classroom, but you can't take the classroom out of the professor. So I have some slides that I'm going to share with you. So you should be seeing the slides now. I'd also like to assure the nerds in the group that you can get these later at my website, media-politics, and I have the address. I should have the address at the end. So we've talked about some really interesting problems and challenges of journalism. I'm going to kind of take a broader lens and talk about the problem of how Corona creates this great environment for propaganda. We already have issues with this, which we've certainly looked at through the 2016 elections and going forward. But I want to talk specifically about three different things. One, which is how media functions in a crisis and why that kind of opens the door to more disinformation. Secondly, to talk about some observations about Russian disinformation, because that's what I study, and to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But I also want to talk about some an interesting study that was done recently about Fox News and how Fox, for a long time, quite stubbornly linked the virus to a democratic shenanigans, basically. So I'll go through that. I'll give my sources. This will not be on the final, so you can all relax. So let's think about the so-called crisis model of the media. And this was developed by a really wonderful media scholar called Doris Graber. And she got very interested in how the media functioned during 9/11 and other big crises. And there's a pattern that the media work through, which is very understandable. So the media are under a lot of pressure, and as Dana pointed out, more pressure than ever in normal times. But during a crisis, you have this enormous flood of news. Your audience escalates, your news hole opens up, so you're expected to create a lot of content as a journalist, but you don't really have much good information. You have a lot of rumors, you have some video, you know something happened, but it's very, very difficult to, not even to contextualize, but just to get the facts right. So it's a very rapid pace. And those of us who are old enough in the audience to remember 9/11, we remember those first day or so of coverage, very chaotic, very confusing, very distressing in a lot of ways, but also just, it was the reality of the times. Then the crisis, media move into crisis stage 2, where they try to correct past errors. They try to put the situation in perspective. Now you can have data rather than guesses. I'm giving a shout out to print because I'm an ex-print journalist there. We can debate that one. Right now, television is holding, I think, more attention than print. And then finally, you have stage 3. And in stage 3, it does overlap with the first 2 stages, but this is where voices come forward, frames are developed. Think War on Terror, a very effective frame from the White House, or New York Strong. Slogans, sometimes things aren't maybe completely reconciled, but this is a frame in which people can kind of lean into and feel some sense of comfort. Now, leaning into the War on Terror frame had its own problems and issues, but nonetheless, it was a very powerful, pervasive frame at the time. So my guess is 6 weeks in, we're in stage 1. I think we're still really struggling as a society, and journalists are struggling as well. So I think it would be interesting maybe to talk about, you know, where we're at with this, but thinking that if we're in stage 1 does give us hope that things are going to get better. And also, I think, takes some of the burden off the shoulders of journalists who, you can't cover something that's not really coverable. So I think we're seeing some unusual things going on, but I think it's more in nature of the event than the nature of journalism, but happy to debate. So so in the second half of this little mini talk, you know, how are the Russians and the Republicans perhaps capitalizing on this? So Russia has an ongoing war with the United States. I've given you a lovely paper here for, you know, 10,000 dense words on it, if you so desire. But for now, just the top line headline is Russia has very stable, very well-developed propaganda narratives that they consistently use. And I was casually studying the NATO narrative for the past couple of months as a test case. I'm working on some computational linguistics ways of automatic identification of propaganda. And I noticed all of a sudden Corona was popping up in my NATO narrative, which I thought, well, that's strange. But as it turns out, if you think of the narrative as a magnet and all these little iron filings that they suck into it, so they're using the idea that NATO shouldn't have been having drills during the virus, or that it was Russia that sent help to Italy, and then the Italians weren't even polite about it, about what was NATO doing. So it's really interesting to see how in a very chaotic information state that a lot of things are being thrown out there. And I'm not really going to talk about, the Russians are now sort of playing around with this idea of trying to spread a rumor that COVID was started in America, with articles in RT with things like, was COVID started in America? Is that a silly rumor or is it a fact? So I think that's quite interesting as well. Moving on to closer to home, Fox News and coronavirus. I'm using a study by Provalis Research. I have the study here. Again, these slides will be available. Also, more fun things to read in your spare time is a very detailed discussion of some of the major themes here about right-wing media ecosystems, and that the classic is network propaganda, which is available for free at the link provided. So this is going back to the Prevalis study. Here we have 5 networks, ABC, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, and NBC. So what Prevalis does is it mined out all the text from the coverage and found that Fox had a very unusual pattern in terms of pairing the word Democrat with the word coronavirus. And unsurprisingly, also the word media with the word coronavirus, as in Democratic media conspiracy. So here are some of the pullout texts from that. All right, so the media mob, Democrats are weaponizing, politicizing the coronavirus outbreak. Will it come back to fight them? And then President Trump firing back at the Democrats and the media for trying to stoke this mass panic. They also were downplaying the risk of the virus. Now, to be fair, the narrative did change, but the narrative also was quite distinctive. And you can see where Fox is pushing a particular political resonance with the presidents that the other networks were not doing. So they are distinctive. This is also interesting. Prevalis also looked at the expression Chinese coronavirus and Wuhan coronavirus. And here this is, so we see here that the blue is the Chinese coronavirus. And that was a phrase that's been used more by the president and also more by Fox News. But also CNN fell into the trap of geolocating the virus in a way that other networks did not. CNN eventually corrected that. But what I like about content analysis, and because I've spent my whole academic life doing content analysis, is it gives you insights and facts and data about coverage that it's very difficult sometimes to see unless you really get a bird's eye view. This is also an interesting use by Fox of media mob and politicizing. And as you can see, right around the end of February, a narrative on Fox arose that the media mob were continuing to were politicizing coronavirus. And then that falls off as Fox's narrative moves back away from that and more toward the reality of the situation. I will end on a positive note in my last minute and a half. And I hope this will warm the heart of Dana as a journalist. So Americans are following, not unsurprisingly, the COVID story very, very closely. 89% of them are saying it, they're following it very or fairly closely. And that's an amazingly large amount of Americans to be engaged with the news. And here's, I think, let's end on a slightly hopeful note, that the media, 30% of the respondents in this Pew survey thought the media had covered COVID-19 very well, and 40% somewhat well. Now, if we're still in this chaotic first phase of crisis coverage, in which it's very difficult to give the audience a clear sense of what will happen because no one knows. And in other situations like this, sometimes a leader has stepped forward, as Bush did after 9/11, and said, we'll have a war on terror. Do we have someone stepping forward with a narrative? Shout out to Governor Hogan, who I think is doing a good job with the narrative in Maryland. But I think we are a crisis in the search of a narrative right now. So with that, that is the site for the Pew survey, which is great. There's tons of great information about COVID and media audiences. And this is where you would download it. I'm going to put this link in the chat, and I will turn it back over to Katie. Oh, and I will stop sharing the screen. Might be helpful.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So question for all of the panelists, what can the average reader do to fight against the spread of disinformation? You want to tackle that?
Yeah, I think we can tackle it from a scholar's view, a journalist's view, and a computer scientist's point of view. From a scholar's view, I think in your own way, you can not consume sites that, and not give any oxygen publicity to sites that are obviously promoting fake news. Well, I don't like that disinformation. Naeemul, what would you say?
My first suggestion is exercise skepticism. So whenever you see whenever you see something in social media, wait before you share, wait before you act. Try to verify or try to ask yourself whether this is true or false, and whether the links are there, or is it coming from a credible source. What people are commenting, are they commenting that this is not true or this is not verified by WHO or CDC? So do some research before you pass it to your friends and family. And that's number one. And number two, please go beyond the headline. Sometimes the headlines are there to get your click. Sometimes the headlines are there to raise your emotion. So kind of come down and look what's there beyond the headline. So, and if you, after reading the whole story or reading the summary in the first or couple of paragraphs, if you still believe that it is worth sharing, then yeah, you can share it. But yeah, exercise skepticism and read the whole thing before you act.
Deanna, would you have anything to add to that? Oh, hang on, you're muted.
Censorship and disinformation class, we did it on the advice of the students, who were very worried about disinformation and pointed to media literacy as the solution. Decided that it was really a problem of their parents' generation, more so than it was of theirs. So I had them interview someone of their parents' generation. A lot of them interviewed their parents to figure out, sort of what they knew and what they didn't know about checking the news. And then they wrote up a kind of 4-point cheat sheet on how to educate. It's called A Student's Guide to Educating Your Parents About Disinformation. And it did simple things like explaining how you check a URL. URLs are, news sites that pretend to be real sites can be very effective. And it's only really if you check the URL that you can discover or teach somebody how to ferret that out. So I do think it could be, we need a little bit more attention on the generation, on my generation and an older generation. And then secondly, I think to hold the mainstream media to account for when they enable a disinformation narrative or site or fun story to leap into the mainstream and become much more disseminated. I think a lot of them doing that, a lot of the times that they do it for a business reason, which is that it will get a lot of clicks, which may or may not, but they hope may translate to advertising dollars. And so I think the mainstream media need to be held accountable for those judgment calls because they're doing, much more harm than good. That would be my 2 recommendations.
Great. We have another sort of related question. Do you believe the effectiveness of disinformation is directly correlated to the degree of ignorance in the general population? And if so, what can the media do to ameliorate the negative effects of disinformation?
This has been a really tough debate among media scholars because it hasn't been ignorance that's been the problem so much as beliefs. And initially they started to do all these studies about trying to debunk myths, and they would sort of give countering information, and that does work to a degree, but it has to you have to want to change. So yes, I think media literacy and literacy in general is important, but I don't think it holds the only key. And to believe that, unfortunately, takes you down the path of, well, they're just believing this fake information because they're stupid, and that's actually often not true.
We have a question for Naeemul. And it just scrolled away here. How exactly would a chatbot work? Would it be purely a piece of code that is programmed to answer questions, or would journalists think of possible questions that readers might ask and program those in? So he's wondering how would the chatbots be interactive?
It can be actually both. So it can have, so the content creator, she can have an understanding what people might ask about his piece of news, and she can add the relevant questions and answers which cannot go into the news because of size or other limitations, but can go into the chatbot. And it can also be like automated answers from this piece of news or from other external news source to help find the answers. So it can be both predefined questions and also automated questions, and definitely it can be interactive. I mean, it has to be. My understanding is it will be interactive. The reader will write questions and there will be answers, and it can further ask further questions based on the answers. Yeah.
And a follow-up to that, how would you prevent a chatbot from potentially being weaponized in a bad way?
Is it possible to have a little bit more information about what the context is about weaponizing a chatbot?
The person that submitted that question, if you could expand on what you were asking about, that would be great. In the meantime, we've got a couple other questions here. One asks, I've seen arguments for and against covering the local reopen movements that we've been seeing popping up. While these movements may be based on disinformation, participants seem to be joining out of fear and anger. What are your thoughts on those?
I think we definitely have to figure out what they're about, how authentic they are. I know there's some reporters who've been doing stories about how they're organized, but to me, this is akin to kind of watching the Trump movement grow and how the mainstream media underestimated the power of it and the belief system behind it. So I would definitely spend, I would try to get some reporters to embed in those movements, really get to know the people and describe what's going through their head. And of course, if they see some organization behind it that is not transparent, which, you know, there probably is to some degree, I would also write the hell out of that story.
Yeah, I don't think we can make the same mistake we made. Well, I wasn't a journalist in 2016, but the challenge for journalists was they just couldn't believe that some of the Trump supporters genuinely were supporting, and then other people felt very silenced and didn't talk about it. So it was sort of an unknown groundswell of support. So I think what's interesting in that particular movement is it like Trump in the sense that actually a lot of people feel this way, but they're just afraid to speak out. In other words, there's a generally strong public opinion for reopening things? Or is it a very narrow movement that's being amplified in the way that Dana talked about before, about sort of allowing the oxygen of publicity, which is what they used to say about terrorists, the oxygen of publicity to make it seem larger. And I don't think we're to a place where we know that yet, but it's one of these impossible dilemmas for journalists. You know, do
well, and also, what would be the larger motive for that sort of disinformation? I can understand the motive of wanting to criticize the critics of President Trump. I get that. I get the motive of a foreign bad actor wanting to hop on and really add fuel to the fire. But it's hard to imagine why a domestic actor would actually want to cause such havoc unless they were, well, I don't know, why would it be hard to imagine? I guess there are people who do this all the time on the web because they can remain anonymous just for fun. You know, the people who steal from companies or people online or whatever, Zoom bombing, you know, that whole thing. But I don't really know what the political, Sarah or Naeemul, do you have any?
Well, maybe these people really genuinely feel that we should reopen the country. I mean, that might conflict with how a lot of other people feel. But yeah, it's a tough one.
Okay, so we've got the follow-up to the question to Naeemul earlier about the chatbots. He says, chatbot baseline info being manipulated to adjust answers from reputable sources, or the use of chatbots from untrusted sources injecting Q&A style data into legitimate sources. Are those concerns that you've looked at as possible ways for chatbots to be weaponized?
I see. To be honest, I haven't thought about this, but in my understanding, this is a different problem than designing a chatbot. This is more like how can we ensure security and trust in the communication or in the data. So if we look at how Google or how Wolfram Alpha gives us the answers to our questions. So they also collect data, but they also make sure that the data is coming from reputable sources. So if we can ensure that when we design the chatbots, if we can ensure that the data is coming from a reputable source, maybe we can mitigate some part of it. But again, this is kind of it is in a very early stage. So when we talk about research, we have to do a lot of research before we can kind of think about something that can be deployed in the newsrooms. And hopefully we can start something with very simple, maybe just the predefined questions and see how the users respond. And maybe that can help us design the automated version of it.
Great, thank you. We have another question that writes, 9/11 brought the country together, but COVID-19 seems to be dividing us further. The right largely blames the media and Democrats for what they would call a disinformation campaign. Are we ever going to agree on fact versus fiction? What will it take for that to happen? I think that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what Sarah said about Fox News is a little bit helpful here, because Fox News did come around and stop doing some of the things that it had originally been doing. I think they were my knee-jerk reaction was they were protective of the president. They were saying what they were kind of mimicking his line, and when his line changed, they did change. So I don't quite see it as an us versus. I don't quite see it as divisive as other things. And then you have this open up group, which we don't really understand enough about.
I think the issue, the problem becomes sort of respectful dialogue, right? And I think someone else was commenting in the comments that it seems like, again, it's you're not my kind of media, so I don't believe you. I think it could be a moment, and I have to say that I have certainly seen less divisiveness on certain issues as we work through this. I've also been looking at the British media because I spent a lot of time in Britain and I'm very interested, and they're trying the more cheerful approach. Look, this baby survived, not this baby died, that kind of framing. I think Americans, I think we're kind of tough and we're cynical, but we're also, I think, a little bit, what's the word I'm searching for here? We're sentimental, So I'm cautiously optimistic that maybe we can, because we're going to have to. I think we're going to have to find a resilience frame, and we're going to have to move forward, I think.
Well, that's why I was kind of surprised, Sarah, that you think we're still in just stage one of the media cycle, because
I want people to argue with me about that. I want pushback.
Well, stage 3 also has the resilience part in it. And I think that we see people coming together, being resilient, hospital workers, and then people going outside and cheering hospital workers. And that is getting a daily drumbeat of readership. I don't know.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest problems in sort of studying or talking about or analyzing the COVID crisis is it's so unprecedented, and it's that this amount. I imagine it was like this during wartime. I mean, I kind of sort of remember the end of the Vietnam War, but maybe that's a better parallel of this, and I'm finding our footing with that, but I don't know. Oh, Katie, you're muted.
Okay.
We have another question for Naeemul. Interested in your research about linguistic features of headlines and their correlations with uptake and shareability. She's asking, beyond some of the examples you mentioned, what sorts of linguistic features have you been investigating, and have you considered overlaying linguistic features with particular social networks, and whether certain linguistic features are more likely to be picked up on certain networks?
I see. In that study, we looked into two aspects of a headline. One is the level of information in it. So the way we quantify information is how many WH questions is answered in the headline. So if it has only 2 pieces of information that answers 2 WH questions, then it's a low informative headline. If it has answer for more than 3 WH questions, we say it as a high information headline. And then we try to see the engagement, like so given 2 versions of headlines, one low, one high, of the same story to the user, we try to understand on average which version gets more clicked. So our finding is the high information version generally gets more clicked, and the difference is statistically significant. So that's the information part. The other way we look at it is the way people write headlines. So I can pose question in the headline. I can give kind of advice in the headline. I can have listicle, like 5 things you should do, kinds of things, and kind of like more persuasive, like model, things you should, or things you must, you have to, you ought to, like the presence of modal words in headlines. So we looked at these 4 types of styles, and we tried to understand how people's selection behavior kind of impact, kind of changes or get affected by these 4 styles. So our finding is only the question style was significantly selected less than the other 3 styles. And the other question was about social media. So we haven't, we have looked into the presence of clickbaity headlines in Facebook. We did a large-scale study on about close to 1 million news articles from about 200 US-based media, and our conclusion was both mainstream and unreliable sites, they practice clickbait headlines. And in broadcast media, we have the presence practice of more clickbait than print. And I think we also looked at the behavior of sharing, commenting, and liking with respect to the presence of clickbait. As far as I can remember, clickbait headlines had more share and more comment than a non-clickbait headline. If you are interested, I can share the paper link with you.
Great, thank you. So somebody asks, University of Chicago economists published a working paper comparing the effect of viewing Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson on behavior regarding the coronavirus. She's wondering if any of the panelists have read that study. Are any of you guys familiar with that at all?
I haven't read it. When you try to say that a particular type of media consumption will trigger this type of behavior, it's kind of tough because we don't know, it's a chicken and egg problem. We don't know if you watch a particular program or consume a kind of media because you had that pre-existing belief or value or desire to do an action. And sadly, for a media scholar, we find that actually media consumption is not that strong a predictor of things like voting and action. Far stronger predictors are things like, if your parents were Democrats, you're probably going to be a Democrat, which depresses us media scholars, so we don't talk about it a lot. But if you could put the link or a little bit more information, oh, it's there. Oh no, that's a clickbait paper. Yeah, if you could put it in the chat, I would love to see that.
Yeah, she says that there, she references Vox having a coverage of that study that implied a causal link between viewership and likelihood that someone would die of coronavirus. which in itself seems like a sensationalist headline. And there she just shared the link to the paper there.
Great.
Sarah, if you can see that in the chat.
I was Googling already. Yes.
Katie, could I respond to the, I think there's one that you might have missed. I can't, it scrolls pretty quickly,
Yeah.
but.
Yeah, definitely.
And I can't get it back up, but I know what it was saying, which is maybe the media is being used too much to spread the media's ideology, if you will, and that what we need is to listen to each other more. In a lot of ways, I couldn't agree more. I think that too many of the mainstream media have forgotten that that's their role. And it kind of goes back to the question of the opening, the pro-open groups. I think that what I try to do in my classes is really teach students to zone out on all the division. Your role, one of your primary roles as a reporter is to figure out what's happening and to listen to people and to let them talk and to not engage in assumptions and in lazy language that links certain actions with other actions without any proof. And I see that happening all the time, even at the Post, especially in this era. So I hope that at some point, this generation at least will get back to doing that and really understand. I don't think that the media has been held accountable for our lack of understanding what was going on in 2016 with all the Trump supporters. And the leadership sort of recognized that they were surprised, but then that was it. We didn't really go back and say, well, why were we surprised? And what does it have to do with our own institutions? So I really encourage people to continue to criticize us and to continue to try to get us to look at ourselves, because in this division, the media is such a powerful actor of division.
I agree with all of that, but I think though it's not fair to call the enemy the enemy. It's not fair to call the media the enemy of the people. So I think the media are the only thing between us and authoritarianism. I think the media are just such an incredibly valued institution. We're down to about 12% of the world has a free media anymore, and it's sinking every year. So I agree with you. I don't like discussions that just say there's this one problem in one part of the media and all the other media are great. But I do think there's a qualitative difference though when the media are attacked for doing their jobs, and that I think is regrettable on the part of the president, and I think it's regrettable when Fox News and others.
Yeah, I'm definitely not supporting that. Yeah.
No.
Great. Well, thank you to everyone. It is about 8 o'clock here. So we've come to the end of the hour, and my cat wants to jump in front of the camera here. But thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you found the discussion informative this evening. There are a couple links that were shared in the chat box. The link to the clickbait study that Naeemul mentioned, and the article that somebody asked about. So please take a look at those. I also just wanted to mention really quickly, we do have 2 additional programs coming up in the next couple weeks. On Tuesday evening, Dean Lucy Dalglish will be interviewing University of Maryland alum Peter Melman about his new book called Me As Well. Peter, as many of you may know, was a longtime writer and producer for Seinfeld. And then on May 6th, we have a panel of all Merrill College alumni who will be talking about their experiences in reporting on the coronavirus and about media coverage of the virus overall. So I encourage you to take a look at those programs and hopefully join us for those. So good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.